time plagued by ignorance,
with none to take a stand.
Religious architecture takes its toll.
during a time of eye-opening brilliance,
The beauty came to life.
Ancient religious architecture. Before the explosion of architectural revolution, the Ottoman Empire was reaching a new height of power. This time had the opposite effect in Europe, though. In Europe, education had slipped through the cracks of the Roman Empire. The greatest power of the time was religion, which could affect anything from what you ate to whom kings waged wars on. Religious growth also led to growth in other areas, such as art and architecture. Religious architecture was the most extravagant because it was allotted the most money, and often the best architects felt that they were bound by religion to build the greatest cathedrals. The Muslim religion required that mosques be large enough to fit the whole population of a city or town. There were key parts to a mosque, unlike cathedrals that had guidelines. The key features included a hot room, a warm room, and a cold room, and a minaret, which was used to call people to pray. Mosques were built in octagonal shapes. They had a mirad which pointed towards Mecca, which is the heart of Muslim religion. They also had many square shapes in the architecture and large domes, though domes were not required. These great mosques were built on the ruins of their predecessors to keep a steady foundation.
Architecture was a key influence to the formation of many religious aspects in the Middle Ages. Cathedrals were the primary church buildings and evolved architecturally from the ancient Roman basilicas that were previously the main focus of architecture. Churches were the central buildings in town and were designed to be impressive structures, drawing the attention of all people to the church itself. With their thick stone walls and towering heights, these massive structures were built to hold their ground while also providing a beautiful place of worship. The floor plan in these breathtaking buildings was in the shape of a Latin cross. On each side of the church, also known as the arms of the cross, there were aisles. These aisles faced towards the altar, which was the main focus of the church service and where the most important events of the church took place. The stained glass windows and the tall walls allowed light to shine through and illuminate the altar, drawing attention to the right area. The builders of these cathedrals attempted to span as much space as possible and to allow in as much light as they could with each new church built in as little time as possible. This was a tough criteria to meet, taking into consideration that each church took an immense amount of time to build.
Gothic architecture was spread throughout many different cultures. These cultures kept the styles of the buildings the same. These cultures kept columns, rounded arches, and domes similar for better looks. The most common public buildings to have seen with the Gothic architecture style were churches. These churches were set apart from others because of the features that were brought to the buildings. These Gothic churches had pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and soaring walls. The features in these buildings are much more elaborate and detailed than the features in the classical buildings. The Gothic architecture brought a new twist to buildings by creating different variety within the building. During the 13th century, stained glass windows were introduced into the churches. This style of stained glass brought the buildings to life by using bright colors and new features. Decorating the insides of the buildings with higher arches and bigger ceiling vaults allowed the buildings to appear more spacious and open to the people. Gothic architecture brought a new sense of style to life during this time.
Domes during the Renaissance were built using thick walls and supports towards the bottom, and progressively thinner walls towards the top. Sometimes the domes were double-walled, meaning they were hollow in the middle. This was to take weight off the supports and the apex of the dome. The dome was built with arches as supports and with bricks and mortar. Domes in the Ottoman Empire were built using either square or octagonal bases. The bases had a foundation that reached bedrock and oftentimes were built on the old ruins of mosques. Since the Islamic and Christian architects gained inspiration through the Byzantine and Roman empires, the construction was very similar and used the same cross-hatched mortar and brick style. Unlike the cathedrals of Europe, the mosques were built differently for each area they were in because of different religions and
Gothic architecture during this time had left an impact on the churches. Churches had many additions to them that allowed the change. Some churches went from having an open roof to having a stone vault roof. Other churches went from having regular windows to colorful stained glass windows. The Gothic architecture added more than just these two things to the churches. Building thicker walls and having smaller windows allowed for the buildings to hold great amounts of weight. This style was useful for the stone roof. Gothic architecture changed the way in which the churches looked on the outside, but also on the inside. With stained glass windows, it allowed for more light on the inside of the building. This style changed the way of churches greatly.
Cathedrals during this time period differed from mosques, although they were similar in shape and structure. Both mosques and cathedrals used stone as their primary building source, and each had thick walls molding its shape. Mosques tended to use massive domes on the top of their buildings, and thick walls of the structures were used to support the weight of the dome. Cathedrals swayed more towards using the thick stone walls to allow the church to reach its massive heights. Mosques also used more octagonal shapes in their base structures, while churches seemed to stick to the cross shape. Cathedrals also used stained glass incorporated into their buildings, while mosques used murals along the